For weeks, whispers of division drifted through palace corridors until one carefully staged appearance changed everything. When King Charles stood beside Princess Anne in full public view, royal watchers stopped asking whether there had been tension and started asking what had just been settled behind closed doors. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For days leading up to that moment, reports and commentary surrounding the royal household had become increasingly difficult to ignore. No official statement acknowledged disagreement. No senior aide stepped forward to address speculation. And yet, conversations surrounding the monarchy seemed to circle back to the same unsettling question. Had something shifted at the highest level of royal authority? The appearance itself should have been routine, another public engagement, another carefully managed royal moment. But observers immediately noticed details they believed carried meaning far beyond ceremony. Princess Anne was not simply present, she appeared positioned with unmistakable significance. Beside the king, close enough to invite interpretation, calm enough to suggest certainty. In royal life, where symbolism is often treated as a language of its own, placement matters. What followed was immediate. Commentators began revisiting earlier reports that had quietly circulated in royal coverage for weeks, stories hinting at differing views connected to the legacy of the coronation period and questions surrounding ceremonial influence inside the modern monarchy. Not disputes in the ordinary sense, not public confrontations, but differences in philosophy, differences in approach, and, according to various interpretations, differences over how the institution should evolve after one of the most significant transitions in modern royal history. Princess Anne's name repeatedly surfaced in those discussions. For decades, Anne has occupied a unique role inside the royal structure, never the loudest figure, rarely the most publicly celebrated, yet often described as one of its most disciplined and uncompromising protectors. During moments of uncertainty, her reputation has remained remarkably consistent: duty first, appearances second, sentiment somewhere after that. That history suddenly became impossible to separate from the image now dominating headlines. Why stand together now? Why, after weeks of speculation? Why allow cameras to capture a moment that seemed designed to answer questions nobody had formally asked? Official palace language remained measured, predictable. References to continuity, public service, and ongoing engagements offered little beyond standard reassurance. But restraint inside royal communications often creates its own vacuum, and vacuums invite interpretation. Observers began studying everything: the timing, the expressions, the pace of interaction, the atmosphere surrounding the appearance itself. Some argued it reflected nothing more than routine coordination between siblings who have spent a lifetime understanding the weight of public duty. Others believed something more deliberate had unfolded behind closed doors, a reset perhaps, or a reminder. Because when institutions built on tradition feel pressure, they rarely respond through confrontation. They respond through signals, and this one appeared impossible to ignore. The king, facing continued scrutiny over the future direction of the monarchy, stood beside the one royal often associated with steadiness under pressure. Anne, whose presence has repeatedly become symbolic during moments of transition, appeared neither distant nor ceremonial. To many watching, the message seemed controlled but unmistakable. Continuity remained intact, yet the more people focused on that appearance, the more another question emerged. If this public moment had been designed to project unity, what exactly had required reassurance in the firsts? Place? Because according to growing speculation, the appearance itself wasn't the real story, it was what reportedly happened before they ever stepped into public view. The rumors didn't begin with a speech or a leaked memo, they began with questions. Questions about influence, ceremonial decisions, and who still had the king's ear. After that carefully watched public appearance, the conversation surrounding the monarchy did not calm down, it intensified. Because for all the attention focused on where King Charles stood and who stood beside him, another possibility quietly emerged beneath the headlines. Perhaps the appearance had not been designed to create unity at all. Perhaps it had been designed to confirm that unity had already been restored. And suddenly, people began retracing the path backward. Reports and commentary started connecting moments that previously seemed unrelated. A delayed appearance here, a measured statement there, a subtle shift in who appeared during certain ceremonial occasions. None of it proved conflict. None of it confirmed disagreement. But together, according to those following royal affairs closely, they formed something more powerful than evidence. They formed a pattern. At the center of that pattern sat an uncomfortable idea, not a dispute over personalities, a dispute over direction. Various interpretations began circulating around differing views connected to the legacy of the coronation period and what should follow it. One side of the discussion, according to ongoing speculation, favored protecting established protocol with almost unwavering discipline. The other appeared more focused on adapting public symbolism to a changing era while maintaining continuity. And that distinction mattered, because in royal life, ceremonial decisions are rarely only ceremonial. Every appearance carries meaning. Every adjustment becomes precedent. Every tradition preserved or altered sends a signal about what comes next. That is where Princess Anne's role suddenly became impossible to overlook. For years, Anne has carried a reputation that few inside royal coverage attempt to challenge. Disciplined, structured, relentlessly loyal to institution before emotion. Not resistant to change, but cautious about change becoming performance rather than principle. Observers revisited old accounts of Anne's approach during previous transitions and major state occasions. Again and again, the same descriptions appeared: measured, direct, and deeply protective of continuity. Not because tradition itself was sacred, but because instability, in royal terms, carries consequences far beyond headlines. King Charles, however, occupies a different position entirely. He inherited not only a crown but a moment unlike any monarch in generations. Expectations for modernization, pressure for relevance, demand for continuity. Expectations that often pull in opposite directions. That balancing act may explain why so many narratives began forming around him. Some commentators framed the situation as natural institutional debate, nothing unusual inside a family and monarchy navigating historic change. Others suggested more tension beneath the surface. But palace sources and official voices reportedly remained restrained, consistently presenting the image of continuity and collective purpose. No denial, no confirmation, only discipline, which, paradoxically, encouraged even more interpretation. Media narratives began splitting into separate camps. Some insisted the rumors had been exaggerated from the beginning. Others argued that royal history had always moved this way, not through public declarations, but through quiet recalibrations that only become visible afterward. And once that idea took hold, people stopped focusing on what had been said. They started paying attention to what had changed. Because once observers looked back, they began noticing signs that something had been building for months. No announcement ever confirmed a disagreement. But in royal life, silence often speaks louder than statements. By the time observers started looking back across previous months, the conversation had already changed. The question was no longer whether there had been tension. The question became whether the signs had always been there and whether people simply chose not to see them until now. Because once patterns enter public conversation, ordinary moments stop feeling ordinary. Royal schedules that would once pass unnoticed suddenly attracted scrutiny. Engagement calendars were compared. Timelines were revisited. Appearances that had seemed routine were now being interpreted through an entirely different lens. Not because anything dramatic had happened in public, but because in institutions built on ritual and repetition, even subtle changes invite attention. People began asking difficult questions. Why had certain appearances unfolded differently than expected? Why had moments that once appeared synchronized begun attracting speculation about distance and recalibration? And why, during periods where symbolism carried extraordinary weight, did certain combinations of appearances seem less frequent than before? None of those questions produced definitive answers, but together they created something far more powerful, a feeling that something beneath the surface had quietly shifted. Royal correspondents and longtime monarchy watchers found themselves revisiting old habits of observation. They examined timing. They revisited public remarks. They compared sequencing and tone, not searching for scandal but searching for rhythm, because royal institutions operate through rhythm. When that rhythm changes, people notice. Different interpretations emerged. Some argued there was nothing unusual at all, that changing schedules reflected modern demands, health considerations, and evolving priorities. Others believed these patterns resembled moments from earlier chapters of royal history, periods where public calm existed, alongside private recalibration. Historical comparisons inevitably followed. Observers recalled previous transitions where the monarchy had faced pressure not through dramatic confrontations, but through quiet adjustments. Changes in proximity, changes in representation, changes in who appeared beside whom during moments that carried symbolic importance. Not proof, but echoes. And history has a way of making echoes feel louder than facts. Meanwhile, official palace communications remained remarkably consistent. Statements stayed measured. Language remained formal. Public emphasis continued to focus on continuity, duty, and service. There was no acknowledgement of internal disagreement because there was nothing publicly acknowledged to explain. Yet that composure created its own paradox. The calmer the palace appeared, the more intensely public fascination seemed to grow. People started reading significance into restraint itself. Commentary expanded. Discussions multiplied. Every apira, Mayan, NCE became part of a larger narrative people were trying to decode. Some insisted the monarchy was demonstrating discipline under pressure. Others believed discipline itself was evidence that difficult conversations had already taken place behind closed doors. And through all of it, one name continued appearing with unusual consistency. Not because she spoke publicly, not because she addressed speculation, but because her reputation seemed to answer questions before official statements ever could. Again and again, attention returned to the same figure, the royal whose public identity had long been tied to steadiness, structure, and an almost uncompromising sense of institutional responsibility. If uncertainty existed, people wondered whether she already knew how to contain it. If recalibration had happened, they wondered whether she had helped shape it. And slowly, almost without anyone noticing, the focus moved away from the rumors themselves. Then attention shifted to the one person many believed could stabilize the moment. If there is one royal figure consistently described as immune to palace turbulence, it is Princess Anne. By the time speculation had reached its loudest point, attention had already begun moving in her direction, not because she addressed rumors, and not because she appeared eager to shape the narrative, but because throughout decades of royal uncertainty, her role had become something unusual. She was less often viewed as a participant in palace storms, and more often viewed as the figure expected to endure them. That distinction matters, because in public life, influence is often confused with visibility. But inside institutions built on continuity, the people with the greatest weight are not always the ones speaking the most. Sometimes they are the ones whose presence changes the atmosphere without changing the volume. Princess Anne has spent years building that kind of reputation. Again and again, during periods of transition, constitutional hang, family pressure, and moments of public scrutiny, her identity has remained remarkably consistent. Duty before performance, obligation before popularity, stability before comfort. And whether fair or exaggerated, that perception has become deeply rooted in public imagination. As discussions around recent events intensified, observers returned to old accounts and familiar descriptions of Anne's approach behind palace walls. Stories resurfaced, not dramatic tales of confrontation, but repeated suggestions that Anne has long been willing to offer difficult counsel when circumstances require it. Not emotional reassurance, not strategic softness, but direct opinions delivered with institutional priorities at the center. That reputation alone changed how people interpreted recent events. Because once the public begins seeing someone as the steady figure in uncertain moments, even silence starts to carry meaning. Over time, Anne's relationship with Charles has become part of that story. Two people shaped by the same institution, raised under extraordinary expectations, witnesses to the same transitions, yet carrying different responsibilities through each era. While Charles prepared across decades for eventual kingship, Anne developed a different identity, entirely one tied not to succession, but to execution. Not the future sovereign, the dependable constant. That contrast may explain why their dynamic continues to attract attention during moments of uncertainty. Observers often note that Anne's value to the monarchy has never depended on public affection cycles or ceremonial spotlight. Her perceived strength comes from something harder to measure: reliability. She appears where needed. She works without dramatizing sacrifice. And in moments where public confidence feels fragile, she represents continuity in a form people recognize immediately. That image carries power, because institutions survive not only through laws and ceremonies but through figures who embody the higher principles. As conversations continued surrounding legacy, coronation symbolism, and the future shape of the monarchy, many began interpreting Anne's recent visibility through that exact lens, not as intervention, not as correction, but as reinforcement, a reminder, a signal that continuity still had guardians, and perhaps that explains why public trust around her role feels unusually durable. People may disagree about royal priorities, royal relevance, or royal decisions, but Anne's identity has remained tied to something simpler, showing up when pressure rises, which is why her appearance beside Charles created such immediate interest. Because if people believed she was there, they assumed it meant something. But that assumption introduced an even more complicated question. Because influence inside the monarchy is never only about personality, it's about timing. Royal appearances are rarely accidental. Every step, every placement, every photograph tells a story. And after weeks of speculation, careful analysis, and competing interpretations, that reality became impossible to ignore. Because once attention settled on Princess Anne's role and the possibility that her presence beside the king carried meaning, the conversation evolved again. People stopped asking whether there had been disagreement. They began asking something more revealing. If there had been pressure behind closed doors, was this appearance intended to say that the pressure had passed? That question changed everything. Royal institutions rarely answer uncertainty directly. They answer through continuity, through ritual, through moments that appear ordinary until viewed in context. And that is why public appearances carry unusual weight during periods of scrutiny, not because they erase questions, but because they redirect them. Standing together sends a message, but the meaning of that message depends entirely on timing. By this point, discussions surrounding recent events had expanded far beyond R. Commentators began examining the broader symbolism surrounding who appeared together and when. Because royal positioning has always been interpreted as a form of institutional language, presence implies confidence, proximity implies alignment, repetition implies intent. Whether those assumptions are fair or not almost becomes secondary once public attention reaches that level. And suddenly, what looked like a routine appearance began carrying much larger questions. Questions about continuity, questions about authority, questions about how a monarchy manages confidence while adapting to changing expectations. Some observers suggested that moments like these matter most during periods when public narratives begin moving faster than official communication. Not because appearances settle debate, but because they create an alternative image powerful enough to compete with it. Image does not replace reality, but image often determines which version of reality people remember. That principle, IPL, has shaped royal history for generations. Again and again, moments of uncertainty have been answered not with dramatic declarations, but with visible demonstrations of steadiness. Public unity has long functioned as reassurance, not proof that tensions never existed, but proof that institutions remain larger than them. And perhaps that explains why so many people focused less on what was said and more on what was shown. Because if public scrutiny had intensified, if questions surrounding succession optics and institutional direction had quietly grown, then appearing together became more than ceremonial. It became interpretive. Some saw reassurance, others saw strategy, many saw both. The king's role in that equation became especially important. Charles carries a unique burden maintaining continuity while also defining an era that inevitably differs from those before it. Every appearance becomes layered with meaning because people are not simply watching a monarch. They are watching how leadership is expressed during transition. That pressure creates a difficult balance. Appear too reactive, and uncertainty grows. Appear too distant, and interpretation fills the silence. So institutions often choose something else entirely: presence. And perhaps that is why this particular moment stayed in public conversation longer than expected. Because people realized something important. Rumors create momentum, but images create memory. And once that realization settled in, the conversation slowly stopped revolving around whether conflict had existed at all. And that's when attention turned from conflict to legacy. Monarchies survive not by eliminating tension, but by controlling how history remembers it. And that may be why the conversation eventually moved beyond rumors, beyond appearances, and beyond the question of whether disagreement had existed at all. Because history rarely preserves every private conversation. It preserves outcomes. Once attention shifted away from space, election and toward meaning, a larger theme emerged, one that has followed modern monarchy through every era of transition. How do you protect continuity while persuading people that change is still possible? That question has hovered over King Charles for years, long before accession, long before coronation, long before every public appearance became examined for hidden meaning. There had already been expectations surrounding the kind of monarch he might become. Expectations of modernization, expectations of adaptation, expectations that the institution would reflect a different century without appearing disconnected from its own foundations. But monarchy exists inside a contradiction. Move too quickly and tradition feels abandoned. Move too slowly and relevance begins to fade. The challenge has never been choosing one side. The challenge has always been surviving both. That balancing act is what makes moments of public unity carry such unusual emotional weight. Because when observers, masses, looked at recent events, many no longer interpreted them simply as reactions to headlines. Instead, they began seeing something larger, a familiar royal strategy that appears throughout history. Absorb pressure privately, project continuity publicly. Not because tension disappears, but because institutions understand that public confidence depends on what endures after tension passes. And in that conversation, Princess Anne's role returned once again. If Charles has often been associated with shaping the future direction of the monarchy, Anne has frequently been associated with protecting its internal rhythm, not resisting movement but ensuring movement does not become instability. That distinction matters more than it first appears, because continuity is rarely dramatic, it is repetitive. It asks people to trust systems during moments when uncertainty feels more emotionally satisfying than patience. Perhaps that is why Anne's presence continued attracting attention. To some, she represents my scented reassurance that the institution still recognized itself. To others, she symbolized something equally important, that adaptation and continuity do not necessarily have to compete. And maybe that is where public expectations became impossible to ignore. After the coronation period, many people were not simply watching individuals anymore. They were watching for signs of direction. They wanted confidence, clarity, evidence that tradition still had purpose and that modernization still had limits. That pressure creates difficult choices. Personal preference becomes smaller. Symbolism becomes larger. Relationships become secondary to responsibility. Because monarchy, at its core, asks something uncomfortable of the people inside it, asks them to become representatives of continuity before they are allowed to become themselves. And that may explain why moments interpreted as reconciliation often feel larger than family dynamics. They become institutional. They become historical, wet. Her recent appearances reflected strategic reassurance, ordinary alignment, or something far less dramatic than public imagination suggested. The reaction revealed something important. People were searching for a story bigger than disagreement, not who won, not who influenced whom, but whether the institution still knew where it was going. And in that search, one idea quietly began replacing all the others. That perhaps the appearance was never meant to erase questions, only to remind people that the monarchy intends to outlast them. Yet one final question continued to linger. What if the real audience wasn't the crowd at all, but everyone watching from behind palace gates? That question lingered longer than the headlines, because after the speculation, after the commentary, after the endless analysis of posture, timing, and symbolism, one possibility continued pulling attention back toward itself. Perhaps the appearance had never been designed to answer the public at all. Perhaps the public simply happened to witness the message. That idea transformed the entire conversation. Until that point, the dominant narrative had focused on visible outcomes who appeared together, what was said, what wasn't said. But once people began considering the possibility of internal messaging, the meaning of the moment became far more complicated, because institutions do not always communicate through announcements. Sometimes they communicate through alignment. And if public appearances carry symbolic weight externally, they may carry even greater weight internally. Suddenly, observers started asking different questions. If there had been competing priorities behind closed doors, what would reassurance look like? If concerns had emerged about continuity, authority, or public confidence, how would stability be projected without ever acknowledging disruption? The answer, many suggested, would not come through correction. It would come through visibility, controlled, measured, intentional. That theory quickly gained momentum because it fit something people already believe about monarchy: that public life and private reality do not always move at the same speed. Public unity does not automatically erase private disagreement. Private disagreement does not automatically destroy public unity. Both things can exist at once. And once people accept that possibility, every appearance begins carrying two stories simultaneously: the visible story and the interpreted one. That is where the media cycle accelerated. Commentary expanded outward in layers. One interpretation produced another. Analysis generated counter-analysis. Some argued people were reading far too much into normal institutional behavior. Others insisted that dismissing symbolism entirely ignored how royal communication has historically operated. Both arguments gained traction, because both contained something true. Royal symbolism matters. But symbolism alone cannot confirm intention. That tension became the center of discussion. How do you recognize symbolism without turning every gesture into evidence? How do you acknowledge public messaging without assuming every appearance hides conflict? Those questions remained unanswered, and perhaps that uncertainty became part of the fascination itself. Because ambiguity creates participation. People do not simply consume stories like this. They enter them. They compare details. They search for patterns. They build narratives around timing. And timing in this case became impossible to ignore. The appearance happened after scrutiny had intensified, after speculation had circulated, after conversations surrounding continuity and institutional confidence had become increasingly difficult to separate from broader public discussion. Whether deliberate or coincidental, the sequence encouraged interpretation. And once interpretation begins, perception becomes part of the event itself. But perhaps the most revealing detail was something much quieter. The Pala, Mayasi, never appeared eager to chase every rumor. There was no dramatic correction, no visible campaign, only continuation, which may have created the strongest message of all. Because institutions built to think in decades rarely respond to moments the same way the public does. They respond by outlasting them. And maybe that is why the entire conversation eventually started changing again. Because after all the theories, all the symbolism, and all the speculation about hidden meanings, people began arriving at a possibility that felt almost unexpected in its simplicity. And in the end, the answer may have been simpler than anyone expected. They stood together for only a moment, but for royal observers, that moment became the headline. And perhaps that is what made the entire story so difficult to let go of. Not because anyone confirmed a dramatic dispute, not because official statements revealed hidden divisions, and not because a single appearance could settle weeks of interpretation, but because that brief moment seemed to capture something larger than the rumors that surrounded it. By the end, people were no longer debating individual reports or trying to identify a winner inside an imagined struggle. They were debating meaning. Looking back across everything that followed the speculation, the analysis, the public fascination, the endless search for signals, one reality remained impossible to ignore. No confirmed evidence ever emerged to prove lasting disagreement. There were interpretations, there were observations, there were questions, but certainty remained out of reach. And strangely, that may be exactly why the story lasted, because uncertainty creates space. Space for projection, space for emotion, space for people to place larger fears and expectations onto moments that might otherwise pass quietly. Royal institutions have always existed inside that tension. They are public enough to invite interpretation, but private enough to resist complete understanding. That balance has never disappeared. If anything, it has become more powerful. The appearance of Charles and Anne seemed to remind people of that truth. Whatever conversations may or may not have happened behind closed doors, what reached the public was something else entirely: a message of continuity. Not perfection, not agreement. Continuity. And perhaps that distinction matters more than people realize. Because institutions are rarely measured by whether tension exists. They are measured by whether tension becomes the entire story. Through all the discussion surrounding symbolism and timing, one image remained stronger than the rest. Two figures shaped by decades of responsibility appearing side by side at a moment when questions had begun multiplying. To some, it represented reassurance. To others, strategy. To many, it represented something simpler, a familiar royal instinct to place duty ahead of narrative. That does not mean questions disappear. It does not mean every interpretation. was wrong. But it does suggest that public appearances sometimes serve a different purpose than people expect. Not to explain, not to defend, only to remind. Remind people that institutions think differently than headlines do. Remind people that continuity is often quiet. Remind people that not every unanswered question points to conflict. And remind people that history rarely remembers every rumor. It remembers moments. As the conversation slowly moved on, what remained was not evidence of division, but the memory of a brief appearance that seemed to carry more weight than anyone expected. Media cycles continued. Interpretations continued. New stories replaced old ones. But that image stayed, because in the end, perhaps the strongest royal message is not the one delivered through speeches or statements. Perhaps it is the one people debate precisely because it was never fully explained. And perhaps that is why this moment resonated so deeply. Not because people discovered the answer B, IUT, because they realized they may never need one. In royal life, silence is rarely empty, and sometimes standing side by side says more than any statement ever could. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.